Okay, so we're fitting up grease nipples into the Himalayan swing arm and various suspension pivots. So now we've got the swing arm out, we've got the drop link, the shock out, and the drop links are on another bench. So most important thing is to work out on the bike where you can actually access the grease nipple. So this is the underside of the suspension, the rear trailing arm. So what I did is I worked out where I can put them, and as you can see, I've just drawn a line across there, and that's where we're going to drill and tap to fit in our grease nipples. In this case, they're going to be 90-degree grease nipples, or 45s, depending on what I've got in my little box, and they'll be set up so they can be greased from the outside of the frame. So swing arm is on the bench now. I've already got the seals and one of the bearings out. So what you'll need to do to get the bearings out is you need to make a tool that's going to fit into the swing arm to push the bearings out. In this case, a nice galvanized fitting, which I have linkaged down, and it fits inside there, like so. So it's you want it under 32 millimeters to go in there. So I've started to push this one out already. So you get to a certain point, obviously, where my pusher, which is a very strong engineer's G-clamp, the foot fits inside, so I'm not worried about that. But obviously I want a receptacle for the bearing to go into at the other end, and in this case I've got a socket here which fits over the end, and as you can see, the other bearing is pocketed neatly in there. So I'll push the bearings out, and then we'll get on to the next part of it. So now bearings have been pushed out, as you can see, and I've just tapped both of the threads for it. So being that I'm going to be using these little 6mm metric threaded 45s for the swing arm, they're a 6 by 6 millimeter, so that's M6 is 6 by 1. So when you're drilling, it's an M5 tap. With metric, as most of you probably know, you subtract the pitch from the diameter, and that gives you the drilling tap size. So I'm going to go ahead and just test fit the grease nipples in here, and then sit it up back under the bike again, and just make sure it's going to sit exactly where I want. Okay, so the grease nipples are now in the swing arm. I've checked the swing arm up in the bike, and they sit and point in a direction that will facilitate the grease gun getting on. I know some of you will have thought about this already, but I'll just show you the grease nipples themselves. Obviously, you've got to take a little bit off the bottom of those, just so that they're not impinging on that tunnel where the bearing goes through. And now we move on to the slightly more controversial part of it. I'm sure some of you have already thought about this, but the bearings themselves are in a sealed shell, the roller bearings inside the swing arm. So because I've located the grease nipples in the centre of where the bearing shells line up, what I'll do now is I'll get a file, and very gently by hand I will open up the very centre of this bearing to allow grease through. So you don't need a huge gap, because obviously grease is going to get forced through there with the gun. I'm not overly concerned about even a slight nick on a roller, because this is not a high-speed component. It's not a component which has a rotating shaft that's carrying a load under great speed. So just by putting a little groove in there, we allow us to get grease into the bearing. So there we have the finished bearing. From past experience, I found the best way, because these bearing shells are obviously very hard, is to get a very thin cut-off wheel. Use the 1.5 millimeter cut-off wheel, and you just put a tiny groove in the center there, just cut it through. When you do, you just line it up so that the cut is going to line up with the center of two of the needles, and you don't do a full cut. So then you get it down to a thickness so that by rotating the needle it lifts it up. Then you pick up the small bit of swarf that's in there, and with some tiny needle files you just deburr the actual cut itself. I've done this on many motorcycles that have done, you know, tens of thousands of kilometers on the swing arm without any issue, but the ability to be able to get grease into that pivot far outstrips any of the possible ramifications of opening the bearing up. So an important part of the process is to make sure you line up the groove with the hole for the grease nipple. Otherwise, all of this is for nothing. So when you're putting it back together, make sure you get the bearings the right way around. So that means the bearing number is on the outside and the newly cut hole lines up with the grease nipple hole. Okay, grease nipples are installed. All the end seals are on. As you can see, plenty of grease comes through. Check it up on the bench, of course, to make sure that grease is coming through the nipples all the way into the bearings, and to make sure that the inner bearings slide neatly on the bearing races, the needle races in the arms. So now I'll fit this up into the bike and I'll show you where the grease nipples end up positioned. And before I forget and put this in the bike, just to remind you that you'll need to make a hole in the swing arm protection strip where the chain rubs, of course. So you'll need to make a hole that lines up with the grease nipple. Okay, swing arm is now fitted back up in the bike. And I've just approximated the position where it sits. So as you can see, this is the hardest side to access, the chain side. So you can see the grease nipple sits in a really nice position, really easy to get the grease gun on there. Just go around the other side. Bring my lighting over as well. It's a bit dark in the garage today. And this side here, even with the brake, the rear brake in the way, you can see really easy to get in there and get onto that grease nipple. So that's it. That's setting up the rear swing arm with grease nipples on the main bushes. So now we'll move on to the rest of the suspension linkages. Moving on now to the shock absorber pivot. So you only need to push out the bearings and seals on the top mount on this, because the bottom mount has two of the same needle rollers, but they sit here and here. There's quite a significant gap in the middle there. So we'll just be putting our grease nipple into the bottom down there, probably just towards the back to stop it getting wiped out. On the top though, as before, you just push out the two needle races in there. On this case, a 17mm socket and an appropriate socket for the races to drop into. And yeah, just push them out in a vise or with a G-clamp, whatever you've got handy. And then it'll be prepped and ready for drilling for the grease nipple. So the perfect position for this one happened to be on the underside of the boss where the needle rollers fit into. So that's tucked up out of the way. It's not going to cop any mechanical damage from rocks or anything like that. Just got the bearings in kerosene. We'll just give those a bit of a clean and then we'll look at the next step. For these bearings, to allow grease to penetrate into the needles, we just relieve the side of the cage. So as you can see, we just give it a light linish, take a little bit of material off, and then it leaves a gap that the grease can get through, having gone through the grease nipple. Once again, we'll mark these up and we'll align them so when they go in, it lines up with the grease nipple. So for the lower race on the shock pivot, you just find the center of the boss where the needle rollers go in, and you drill and insert your grease nipple into the hole there. So there's no need to remove the bearings on this and no need to relieve them, because the bearings have a big gap in between the two of them, so there's plenty of room for the grease to go through. And when you're packing it, you'll be able to see the grease come out through the rollers. So just make sure you clean it well with Kero inside there to get rid of any swarf. And this one locates right in the middle of the bracket. You can sort of see it's well protected in there. It's not going to get hit by rocks or anything. Okay, so we've got the drop link mounted back in for the suspension there, and as you can see, we'll just roll back underneath. You can see the grease nipples there, very accessible and very protected. Just get that into focus. There we go. As you can see, really easy to get to and well protected. So I've pressed the bushes out of my dog bones. As you can see, they're in there, bushes marinating in a bit of kerosene there. So having sat this on the bike, I've already worked out that on the underside there, right up where the casting meets the boss of the dog bone there, that's going to be the ideal spot. It's going to be out of the way, and I'll stick a couple of straight grease nipples in there. So I'll drill that and then show you what happens after that. Once again, we just put a light nick in the outer shell of the bearing to allow the grease to penetrate, and we make sure that we line it up with the grease nipple hole on the way back in. So there you have it, dog bones reinstalled. As you can see, grease nipples, really accessible position there. Just having a bit of a recap, those grease nipples there. We have the grease nipples on the main suspension pivot there, and then we have, of course, our grease nipples on the swing arm itself. So it was, you know, a little bit of work. You've got to take the suspension arm out and remove all the suspension, but nothing you can't do at home in your garage. It's pretty easy, and it allows you to maintain the suspension properly and without having to strip it down in order to correctly lubricate the bearing. So hopefully that helps some of you out, and yeah, thanks for watching.